Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. I am Zarqa. I am a lecturer at College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hamad bin Khalifa University. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all at today's very important and timely discussion on racism and discrimination in the Gulf. This event is both in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and also inspired by the movement to have a more localized discussions on the topic of racism and discrimination. To all our audiences, I hope you're all well. I hope you're safe. We cannot see you or hear you, but you can see us and hear us. And just a note that your mics are automatically muted once you join, but you are able to talk to us by sending us your questions through the Q&A box that is on your right side. Now, before I get comment in depth on the background of today's topic and contextualize its relevance to the Gulf states, I would like to first of all invite Dean of College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dictora Amal Al-Malki, for her opening remarks for today's event. Dictora Amal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zarqa. Good evening. On the behalf of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hamad bin Khalifa University, I would like to welcome you all and welcome our viewers and our panelists who have gathered to tackle one of the most controversial yet timely topics. We at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences are driven by the collective belief and commitment to social justice. We strive to be agents of change and work collaboratively with other social actors to achieve this goal. Our programs are geared towards social impact and we're set to be relevant and address local challenges. Our research agenda include areas of grave importance such as diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, as well as gender equality and empowerment. Our alumni and students create a community of language and cultural mediators, gender specialists, and digital humanists. When graduating, they leave with a clear understanding of their mission as engaged professionals and researchers, and above all, the responsibility to be active citizens who understand the value of diversity and promote equity in whatever context they might find themselves in. Discrimination and injustice are not bound by time or space and had always been one of these pandemics that humanity suffered from. In the age of abundance that we live in, where half of the world lives in the midst of continuous stream of information and communication, the realities of the misfortune and privileged were left to the background. COVID-19's lockdown turns to be a blessing in the sense that few, and I emphasize few, of the injustices that the humanity face came out to the surface at a time where people were watching, and the focus on racism and racial discrimination was one of them. But racism and discrimination is not one of the topics that we comfortably talk about in the Gulf. This doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Discrimination, whether racial or based on ethnicity or gender, is pretty much a reality. Moreover, the demographic and economic specificities of some of the countries in the Gulf present a modern form of institutional and structural discrimination. The newly established nation states in the Gulf have their distinct cultural and ethnic backgrounds, which largely contributed to their citizenship and national identity formation. No one can deny the role of ethnicity and its importance in shaping the national identities of the Gulf countries. In taking a quick scan, we can pinpoint some areas of institutional discrimination in the Gulf associated, for example, to citizenship law. Some of these areas are tiered citizenship in many countries, where holding the passport doesn't translate into being a full citizen. Gendered citizenship, where women are second-class citizens in the Gulf. One of the main discriminatory laws prevent women to pass on their nationality to their children like men. And also the rights of the minorities who form sub-identities in the societies, such as bidun or carriers of travel documents. You cannot talk about racism and discrimination in the Gulf without standing on the injustices that immigrant workers face in these countries. The modern slavery, as some call it, ranges from the kafala system, a highly discriminatory system, to their work and living conditions. COVID-19 should present a case study to expose how these countries have dealt with the immigrant workers, and what measurements were put in place to protect them, just like other sectors of the population, which I'm afraid would expose some of the inhumane practices that took place. So yes, racism and discrimination is a topic that is very relevant and that should be discussed. And we believe in the college that it is our duty and role to present these topics and start a healthy conversation between academia, intellectuals, and the public, and hopefully will reach to the decision makers, because after all, it's our collective responsibility to build a fair and just community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amal, for your very thought-provoking remarks. And I would also actually like to thank Dr. Amal for not only supporting us to have these conversations that are not very often, discussed in the society, but also encouraging us. We've been discussing topics of diversity, belonging, and othering, and racism in our college, in our classrooms and also in our workspaces. So thank you, Dictora, and also to thank Qatar Foundation for giving us the platform to not only have this discussion locally, regionally, but also internationally. Now, before I go to my brilliant panelists, I would like to contextualize the Black Lives Matter movement a little bit in the Gulf context. The Black Lives Matter BLM protests that were triggered by the killing of George Floyd on the 25th May by a police officer was a wake-up call, is a wake-up call to humanity that racism is well and alive, and that we need to put an end to it, and that we can no longer afford to be quiet on such issues. So the BLM since then has prompted a series of discussions globally about racism, as well as the perception of justice and injustice. He wasn't killed by a police officer after all. Now, I will not go deep into what racism really is and what it means. I'm going to leave this for Dr. Luana, who's one of our panelists, to talk about this in further detail. But I do want to highlight that racism is more than just an act of hatred. It is a deep-seated philosophy and a belief system that the self can be superior than the other, and the other is then demonized through various systems, institutions, belief systems, and the other is seen as less deserving of the life than the self. Now, it is important for us to highlight that what happened in the U.S. was not a spontaneous outburst of, anger, but it was a result of years and years of institutional and structural racism against the Black Americans. Now, it is necessary, like Dr. Amal mentioned, for us to use this momentum started by BLM a movement to acknowledge and work on racism and discrimination locally, which here we're talking about the Gulf states. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some narratives that emerged as a response to Black Lives Matter movement. I've been observing them closely and analyzing some of them. So, in my analysis, I think there was three main narratives that emerged as a response to the movement. First narrative, which was supporting BLM movement in the U.S., but refused to talk about any forms of racism or discrimination in the region or locally. Now, the second narrative, there were people that were talking about some sort of racism locally, but really on a very superficial level and not really diving deep into the concept of race itself, the concept of racism itself. And the third group altogether denied the existence of any type of racism or discrimination in the Gulf on the basis that these are Islamic societies, and since Islam promotes equality, and is against any types of discrimination, there is no problem at all. Indeed, Islam does support equality, but that doesn't mean that this is what is implemented in our societies. So those who were denying any types of racism or discrimination in the Gulf were actually revealing their own privilege. Just because you're not personally affected by racism and discrimination, it does not mean that it does not exist. So the main takeaway for us here is that we cannot fight other people's oppression without first fighting our own. So racism looks very different in the Gulf than it does in the US, for sure. Dr. Emil has already pointed out some forms of discriminations that exist in the region. But before we start to talk about fixing the law to fix the problem or problems, we have to first acknowledge that racism exists in the Gulf societies like it does in the rest of the world. I believe that the starting point is to reassess our own understandings of racism and to check for internalized biases, and then we can start asking questions, the right questions. Racism is also more than just black and white. It comes in different shapes and forms and is reproduced and perpetuated through everyday practices throughout the Gulf. We have to start by deconstructing discrimination. We need to look at practices that construct the other and the stranger-making practices. Why are some people considered as strangers while others are more at home naturally? We also need to look and ask for how certain norms are established. And this is particularly important because normalizing something is how you reproduce several forms of discrimination. For example, racial discrimination is reproduced in the Gulf, to give an example, through jokes, through nicknames, through personal impressions, expressions, everyday communications that are undocumented and unspoken of. Now, before we can talk about institutional and structural racism in the region, we also have to discuss how is this manifested in our interpersonal relationships. And so, briefly, the purpose of our panel today really is to start a discussion and have a conversation about a topic which has become globally relevant but is under-discussed in the Gulf. And I hope it will be the first of many discussions. There is still a sort of stigma that is attached to the topic of racism and discrimination in the Gulf, hidden biases against invisible groups. So the aim for us today really is not to provide simple answers or explanations. And I speak mostly from about myself. We're all here, I believe, because we care about this issue and we aim to speak from a place of experience, learn from today's discussion, but mostly engage with our audience. Please send us your questions throughout the Q&A session. You can ask questions to our specific panelists, including Dr. Amal, and everyone else will speak now, and I will take your questions at the end. Before I get to my amazing speakers and I introduce them, I want to highlight that it was very difficult for us to convince people to speak on today's topic. And why I should mention that is for two reasons. One, that people are still very reluctant to discuss this issue, and that is exactly why we should start talking about it now. And number two, the women who are joining me today are exceptionally brave and ambitious women, and I applaud you for the work that you've done. And now, without further delay, I would like to start introducing our panelists. First, we have Abrar al-Shammari from Kuwait. Thank you for joining us, who is a socio-political writer and a researcher, and will be speaking about the topic of Bidun. This second speaker is Hanan Abdurrahman, who is an attorney and a legal consultant at Gulf Legal Consultants. Hanan, we are so happy to have you, and I look forward to hearing from you. And our first speaker, who's going to speak now, is Dr. Luana Uzamila, who is the CEO of DIMA Consultancy and is an adjunct professor at College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. Luana Uzamila is a Brazilian economist and a CEO of DIMA, an international development company established in Qatar that is a gateway to Arab market for Latin American companies. She also is holds a doctorate in development economics and racial relations and is a researcher advising the dean at HBKU. Now, I don't want to talk more about you. I will let you talk about yourself, introduce some of your work to us, and Dr. Luana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zarka, for this introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here in this panel. I want to congratulate Qatar Foundation, congratulate Dr. Ahmad, congratulate Susan. Is connected for being here. About myself, I have to confess that I am a data and patterns aficionate. You know, I love data and patterns. And one thing that perhaps data from, with data you can uncover the problems and the root causes of those problems. And with patterns, you can understand predictions. And with predictions, you can better devise, solutions for those problems. And one thing that really caught my attention right after the aftermath of the death of the killing of George Floyd was that there was no really sound coming from the private sector and any institutions in the Gulf. In the same time that all over the world, you were hearing commitments, pledges, against racism and discrimination. And from the Gulf, I heard a complete silence. And I'm sorry, perhaps, if because of the little Arabic, I might not have heard, but in general, we have not heard much from this region. And I think part of that is that belief that that's not a problem for the region. It's a US problem, it's an American problem. And I think one thing that I want to start talking about is about the biases that we all have. And we have to face it. We all have biases. And I just want to ask you a few questions to illustrate this assertion that I'm making. And I ask these questions to everybody I come in contact who tells me that they do not see color or that people are people. And I asked them, a doctor or a teacher? And they say, a doctor, you should earn more. Who do you think earn more, a doctor or a janitor? A doctor. It depends. Okay, no, but it must be the teacher. And then I ask, a black doctor or a white teacher? And I hear a pause. And then I continue, a black doctor or a white janitor? A pause. And this pause it happens in practically 100% of times they hear this question. Sometimes it's a really lengthy pause. And that pause is what we call in applied social science and social science implicit bias. We all have it. And that bias, that pause happens only because I put the word black or white in front of occupation. That pause is a discount. That pause, our belief systems. That pause could be ignorance, but that pause is prejudice. So these unwarranted discounts, okay, either by the individual or by an entire society and its institutions about the true worth of a group of people, about their beauty, about their intelligence, about their character. And when one race does it to another, it's called racism. So these unwarranted discounts are very costly. They limit educational and economic opportunities of all parts of a society and a population, and have negative consequences in the long run on aggregate savings, on investment. McKinsey, for example, estimates that systematic racial economic differences may cost up to 6% of the US GDP. And why do I say unwarranted? Some may ask. Because most of the time, when we look at data, we realize that prejudices are incorrect beliefs about people. Let me give you an example. In Brazil, 70% of garbage collectors are Black, okay? And 96% of the executives in the top 500 companies are white. There is a huge social divide that is marked, obviously, by race, okay? But a lot of people in the society believe that to overcome this divide, that this divide can be overcome by effort, by hard work, by merit, implying one group, maybe that's what is lucky, and that's why they are where they are. And that if they were to invest and acquire education, that would destroy all racial economic inequalities. But what we find when we look at data is that a Black woman with a PhD earns on average 50% less than a white woman with a PhD. And what we actually find with data is that the racial wage gap actually increases with education. So let's face it, as you are biased, knowingly or unknowingly, okay? The studies show that biases in judgment eventually lead you to discriminate against a particular group at some point in your life. So what I advise governments to do, and believe me, I have advised several governments in Brazil, Colombia, Panama, Chile, Trinidad, among many others. What I tell them is simply to stop being like the ostrich. Stop burying your head whole body exposed. By avoiding to talk about race is not gonna make racism go away. The first step is to collect and analyze data. Administrative data, survey data. The EU just had their survey about the Black experience, being Black in Europe a few years ago. And yes, racism is pervasive there too. Just to give you an idea, 63% of minority population in Finland experience racism, 52% in Luxembourg, 51% in Ireland, 48% in Denmark and Italy. Now they are discussing what should we do to fight racism. Let's do something about it after they collected the. So the problem, understand the existing biases in society, deter racism in the institutions by understanding the mechanisms. So through data collection and analysis, institutions will come to realize that their traditions and practices can have unintended effects and can produce racially disproportionate outcomes. So efforts need to be intensified because people are not taking anymore. The Arab Spring, the Black Lives Matter movement are society's expression of enough. The BLM has undoubtedly shaped the way America view racial inequality in the last 5 years. The Black movement in Brazil was detrimental in changing how Black Brazilians view themselves, love themselves, accept themselves, and in removing the blindfold so people could see that actually in Brazil, we never lived in a racial paradise. So grassroots movements like the BLM effectively engaging social media mark a new chapter in the centuries of struggle for Black liberation. What BLM was able to actually beautifully achieve and do was to unite unite human rights groups, different human rights groups, for the full recognition of Blacks' rights as citizens all over the world. So moving forward, Blacks will continue to stand up united, occupying online and offline spaces of speech and action, just like this one. Qatar has been ahead of its time and its peers in the GCC in many fronts. This could just be one more opportunity and chapter in which it will show how to tackle racism, discrimination in the context of the Gulf. There are policies that can remedy incorrect beliefs and discomfort, this discomfort that we have with the topic. But we must start early with our children. Early, very early too. So there are policies to remedy unfair treatment in institutions and institutional racism, but data needs to be collected, research needs to be developed. So you might be thinking, oh, Brazil has data, US has data, and yet racism is a commonplace in those places. Data alone will not solve all our problems. But without it, there is nothing to guide leaders who are willing to address these challenges. Every person, business, government must decide for themselves whether or not they are ready to face full head-on. I think this event is a great opportunity to open the curtain and to have a candid conversation about it, to recognize that we all have very dangerous biases, and to become fully persuaded in his or his own mind that by dealing with those biases, we can destroy them. So in your own mind, you need to become persuaded to deal with it. So there is an Igbo saying that says, he who holds himself, he who holds me to the ground holds himself. So let's all get out from the ground and stand up tall against discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Luana, for a very interesting discussion and for talking to us about the power of data and the importance of research as well as grassroots movements. Many lessons to learn, and I hope we can implement some of those in the near future. And now, a reminder to the audience, you are able to ask us questions by posting your questions in the Q&A section on your right side, on the right side of the window. If you want to appear anonymous, you're able to pose questions anonymously. Just add at the end of your question anonymous, and we will not be saying your name. Now, moving on to our next speaker, Abrar al-Shammari, joining us from Kuwait. Abrar is a Kuwaiti writer and a researcher interested in social-political issues relating to the Gulf region and the wider Arab region, particularly the intersection of cultural production and politics, as well as issues of identity, race, and discrimination within Gulf societies against marginalized communities. Abrar is an alumna of MA in Arab Studies program at Georgetown University, Center of Contemporary and Arab Studies, and she has published numerous articles on both in Arabic and English. Welcome, Abrar. We hope you were here with us in person, but nevertheless, like to welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zarqa, and thank you, Dr. Amal. I definitely agree with you that this is a timely discussion, and Dr. Luana highlighted a number of really important points. I think the most important being the fact that racism is born of policies, as Zarqa mentioned at the very beginning, that racism and sentiments of hatred in general aren't simply emotions. They're born out of policies and upheld by institutions that continue to uphold these kinds of policies. And I think especially since this discussion is inspired by the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, it's important for us to also keep in mind that the Gulf context is very different, right? As Zarqa mentioned at the very beginning, that racism, particularly when it comes to the Gulf, isn't as simple as black or white, that it manifests in ways that are very different and not so clear to the naked eye or to perhaps an outsider. So I think in this particular discussion, it's important for us to also define what we mean when we say racism. And given the fact that in the Gulf, it's not necessarily something that's purely taking place on a racial basis, I think one definition that's useful is recognizing racism as a means by which both society and the state allocate status and privilege, which I think is very much applicable in our context. So for my particular segment, I'll be talking about the status of Kuwait's Bidun community. And while that's my particular focus, this does not by any means mean that this is the only community that's subject to racism and discrimination in Kuwait or in the Gulf at large. But I'm focusing on that purely for this purpose of this panel. And I think, just talking about this, and perhaps there'll be some time towards the end, that one of the common misconceptions is that Khaliji citizens could never be on the receiving end of racism. I think there's always this binary of oppressed South Asian versus an oppressive Arab, but it's so much deeper than that. So I'll be giving a brief history of Kuwait's Bidun community and how this issue came to arise. And then I'll be talking a little bit about the contemporary context and the current discriminatory policies and attitudes that they face. And lastly, I'll be talking about access to healthcare, in particular, mental health care. So Kuwait, as some of you may know, was established as a nation state in 1960. And the concept of a nation state was still very much a new concept, not only to people in Kuwait, but to the region at large. So what was required as part of the nation building process was for people who qualified as Kuwaiti citizens to come forward and register for Kuwaiti citizenship. And I think, as is the case with many of our issues of racism, the nationality law played a very big part in this current issue. A nationality law that defined those who have roots in Kuwait from 1990 as a Kuwaiti citizen. And because we're talking about people who are nomads, people who came from the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula and who were primarily illiterate at the time. So this concept of needing a document to prove that you belong to a territorial piece of land wasn't something that really registered with the majority of what is now the Bidun community. And in effect, what happened was a good 1/3 of what was the Kuwaiti population at the time did not apply for Kuwaiti citizenship and were left without citizenship. So for those who are non-Arabic speakers, the word bidun itself means without, and therefore it means bidun jinsiya, without citizenship. So we're talking about people who are indigenous to the land, but because of issues of illiteracy, just simply never applied for citizenship. In the early stages, this was not so much of an issue. Throughout the 60s and 70s, most of them were recruited in the police and the military, and were able to enjoy more or less the same rights that Kuwaiti citizens were able to enjoy, with the exception of one important right, and that was the right to political participation. So they didn't have the right to vote. Aside from that, they were able to access employment, healthcare, they were able to enroll their children in the public education system. By and large, there were none of the same issues that we witness today. The primary turning point was in 1986, where they were stripped of a lot of these rights, and that was in reaction to some of the regional events that was happening, mostly the Iran-Iraq war. And this was further aggravated by the Gulf War later in 1990. There was a solid number that actually ended up being deported, or some who willingly left, recognizing that it's going to be a further deterioration of their situation from this point on, given the amount of tension that existed in Kuwait after the Gulf War. So after that was when they started to be labeled illegal residents. And I think this shift in terminology is quite telling, where at this point, they're rejecting the reality that these are people who are indigenous to the land and who are entitled to citizenship, instead labeling them illegal residents, right? So in the 90s, what happened was there were suddenly a lot of offices who began to sell fake passports. With the knowledge and encouragement of the Kuwaiti government, a lot of Bidoon ended up purchasing these passports in order to do what was labeled as rectifying their situation. Rectifying their situation essentially meant that in order to access a lot of these basic human rights, they were expected to have some form of identification, whether this identification was valid or not. And the consequences of these decisions continue to manifest until this day. So essentially, until they were able to rectify their situations by purchasing these fake passports, they were excluded from the right to education, healthcare, employment. So naturally, because of the coercive nature of this policy, a lot of them ended up doing that. Now, another turning point, I think, in the contemporary context is the creation of what is known as the central apparatus for illegal residents. So you can see that the term itself continued into the contemporary context. The central apparatus for illegal persons, as they call it, was established in 2010, and it was created as this overarching body that's meant to be in charge and responsible for all affairs related to Kuwait's Bidoon community. And many people from Kuwait's Bidoon community have argued that their situation has gotten significantly worse as a result of the creation of this apparatus. Now, I think what makes this particular apparatus so distinct and at the same time removed from much of the values of Kuwait as a country is the fact that it has no oversight and no accountability whatsoever. As some of you may be aware, Kuwait prides itself on its National Assembly and the fact that the National Assembly has a say in how the institutions of the country function, right? So unlike other institutions in the country, the central apparatus has no oversight and cannot be subject to interpellation from the National Assembly, cannot be subject to be challenged by the courts, for example. So much of what happens in these spaces goes against what would normally be condemned in other spaces or institutions in the country. So since this was created in 2010 and in 2011, there were protests from Kuwait's Bidoon community demanding their right to citizenship, demanding their right to access a lot of the basic human rights that they have long been deprived of. In reaction to this, a policy known as security flags was introduced by the central apparatus, whereby an individual's whole family would have a security flag on their names in the government system, effectively banning them from being able to access employment, education, marriage certificates, even a lot of the basic rights. So they came up with a way to collectively punish anybody that engaged in political activism at the time. And with a lot of them, this actually lasted for many years, and some of them continue to struggle with these security flags until this day. Essentially, we're talking about entire families left with no source of income and without the right to work and without the right to enroll in schools. What the central apparatus has done is it has institutionalized what is essentially political blackmail. They also continued to coerce people into, as I mentioned earlier, rectifying their status, but coming up with different ways in a contemporary context. So, for example, recently there were some graduates of Kuwait University who are Bidoon students and graduated, and they were not able to attain their university degrees until they signed a paper admitting to being in false possession. of fake passports. So the coercion continues, and at the same time, I think this then might raise an important question, which is, do you only suffer these consequences if you're politically active? And the reality is that whether you're politically active or not, the political implications of being Bidoon continues to impact you regardless. Because, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, we're talking also about kids who are 8 years old and not able to go to school purely by virtue of them being born Bidoon. So that takes me then to the issue of education in particular. The public education system in Kuwait is primarily designated for Kuwaiti citizens. Therefore, non-Kuwaitis don't have access to the public education system. There's few exceptions when it comes to Kuwait's Bidoon community, and that's children and grandchildren of military men. As I mentioned earlier, since there were some Bidoon who were allowed to enroll in the military, so their children and grandchildren now are allowed to enroll in the public education system. So this leaves Bidoon children with the option of private schools, and that creates a number of other barriers. One of them being the fact that many of them are born without birth certificates. And a lot of private schools mandate that a child has to have a birth certificate in order to enroll. Now, one might assume that if you have a birth certificate and you're Bidoon, then the issue has been solved. But the reality is that then there's the issue of tuition fees. And given the fact that economically a lot of Bidoon are exploited as cheap labor and are underpaid and don't have the same work contracts as Kuwaiti citizens or even their expat colleagues. So they make a lot less money than their peers would, making it really difficult for them to keep up with tuition fees. With that said, the quality of private schools that most of them enroll in is significantly lower than one might find in other private schools. And these kinds of challenges continue well into the university level. Like I mentioned earlier, they're not even able to attain their university degrees without the central apparatus somehow intervening during that process. So there's no job security, even after graduating from university, or benefits. They're not entitled to paid leave or sick leave or annual leave. It's a very distinct type of contract. So we see repeatedly how a lot of these institutional policies play into making sure that Kuwait's Bidoon community is subject to a very different set of policies than their colleagues. Naturally, having experienced all of these issues, as I mentioned, in basically every stage of life, right? We're talking about childhood and then teenage years and then young adulthood and then marriage if they're able to get married. A lot of them struggle with a sense of despair and hopelessness. So there's a very real mental health crisis among Kuwait's Bidoon community. In the past 24 years, there have been 17 known cases of Bidoon suicides, 6 of them being in the past year alone. So there's a significant rise with the deterioration of their conditions. There's a rise in suicide attempts and suicide cases. So while one might think that access to mental health services could aid in improving this situation, the fact is that, and I think this probably applies to Qatar and perhaps the rest of the Gulf as well, that access to mental health care is very much classist. And at least in the private sector, we're talking about prices that are inaccessible and way too expensive for groups who are on the receiving end of this type of racism. While on the other hand, the public sector requires valid documentation, which a lot of the Bidoon do not have. It's either expired or non-existent. And then on the other hand, and I think the media is very much complicit in this, we see that when cases of suicide are covered, the media is quick to point out that this particular individual had a file at the Kuwait Mental Health Hospital, essentially making them out to seem mentally unstable, rather than acknowledging and condemning the institutional violence that led to this suicide in the first place. So there's risks and challenges involved with accessing both public and private mental health care when it comes to Kuwait's Bidoon community. Lastly, I'd like to just briefly talk about resistance and how forms of resistance have changed in the past 10 years. As I mentioned at the beginning, there were protests in 2010 and 2011 that were met with severe repression that lasts until this day. So we see a shift that took place after that point. We see a rise in Bidoon literature, for example, a sort of reclaiming the narrative, where you see a lot of Arabic literature being produced by Bidoon writers who want to tell their stories and their own perspective on their experiences. While this has been met with state censorship, I think with the proliferation of social media and with an increase in creative spaces and cultural production, these narratives have been able to become much more widespread than I think was the case 10 years ago. So this definitely qualifies as a form of soft power that challenges the status quo and kind of forces this narrative to say, I'm here, I exist, this is my issue, and people need to pay attention. And I think the reactions that they've gotten throughout the years prove that these endeavors have certainly been successful.
Thank you, Abrar. Honestly, a bit speechless. Thank you for talking to us about the multi-layered discrimination that the Bidoon have to face in Kuwait. I have come across quite a lot of literature on the Bidoon in Kuwait, unlike the other Gulf states, which I know also have a significant Bidoon community. And thank you also for highlighting the power of storytelling and narrating your own story. A lot of work needs to be done there. Now I would move on to my last speaker, last but not the least, Hanan Abdurrahman. Hanan, as I mentioned earlier, as an attorney and legal consultant. She is the LLB graduate from Qatar University. She is interested in issues relating to human rights, youth, and volunteering activities. She is also a co-founder of the Fasila initiative, which deals with environmental issues in Qatar. I recommend you all to check out this initiative. It's very impressive. Hanan, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Zarqa. I'd like to start thanking both Dr. Amal and Zarqa for giving us the chance to address and talk about one of the more core and important local issues. And it's really rare that we can get the chance to open different files and discuss it with open minds and try to adopt different people cases. And sometimes these people might be beside us, but we don't really see what they're going through. In my talk, I'm gonna talk about workers' rights here in Qatar. I'd like to start with lots of political international pressure have been made upon Qatar in regards to labor rights and Qatar 2022 and so on. I want to put all political propaganda aside and pay attention to the case, not a political point of view as much as lots of people trying to make it political, and it's more like a humanitarian crisis here in Qatar. I'll try to give a brief about labor situation here in Qatar and its connection to Black Lives Matter movement. Maybe Black Lives Matter movement made a different society rethink, review, and question different racist systems worldwide. And one of the main systematic racism is well known in our region, where mostly specific kind of labor suffer more than others. That is known as kafala system. Starting with kafala system, what does it mean? How it changed in the few last years? Kafala system was one of the common feature in all Gulf countries, such as Lebanon and Jordan as well. However, it was earlier modified and allegedly abolished and replaced with contractual system, where the ministry provides companies with a sample of contract which usually company use that includes the minimum rights of the employees and such as working hour, day off, and so on. What also kafala system include is exit permission, where the new law amendments only 5% of the employees in each company could require exit permission. Not to mention that domestic worker situation is still doubtful. I don't know. I don't want to say that it's abolished. It is still there. And nor that Qatari women themselves need that too, but that's under another systematic discrimination system. Okay, allow me to emphasize on this point a bit. Kafala system also made regular working circumstances add more stress, boundaries, and hardship to the regular working environment elsewhere. May I use intersectional feminist ideology to clarify how labor intersects by defining categories of labor we have. So starting with male and female, then different kind of jobs, then private sphere for women and public sphere for men, then external workplace. The more we are in the private sphere, difficult it gets, and more we need legal inspection. For instance, lawyers are more immune, and not necessarily, but in comparison to construction workers, have more chances to be paid without difficulty. Then we have a domestic worker, for example, driver, cook, or housemaid. If we look at it in from a gender perspective, it might be more critical if we are comparing between a housemaid and the driver, where they both suffer, but they intersect. For example, still the female housemaid have very little open space comparing to a male driver who might be able to see his friend or go out every once in a while. There is so many different points that kafala system affects their work situation, starting with maybe working hours and day off. We have basically two laws. First law is the labor law that states in Article number 73 the maximum working hour. I might project something here, or maybe later. So first of all, we have labor law that states the maximum working hour, which is like 8 hours per week, per day. Then we have, in the labor law, they also stated the working hours in month of Ramadan, which is 6 hours. Then we also have maximum working hours in a week. The law also included like resting hours. They should have a resting, hours to rest from 1 hour maximum to 3 hours. When I compare it to domestic worker law, it only states the maximum working hours, which is 10 hours. Comparing it to the labor law, it's only 8 hours. But when you go to the domestic worker law, it's 10 hours. فوق هذا كله it's that's all. They never mentioned what is working hour in Ramadan, neither how to calculate resting hours. Is it like 1 hour to 3 hours? They never mentioned any of that. So in regards to gaps, and I don't want to start giving people an impression like these laws are implemented. Starting comparing between these two laws, especially since neither of these two laws are being fully implemented but labor law differs in comparison to domestic worker law, as I said, like working hour, Ramadan working hour, breaks, and so on. Domestic workers law failed to state what the resting hours is, again, as I said. Then in regards to reality of the cases here in Qatar, all labor cases that I have been working on comes like a package. It includes all kinds of violation in the same case. For instance, working more than 10 hours, not getting paid, no day off, no annual leave, no sick leave, and so on. Almost all the labors that I held in the court worked for more than 10 hours, but because they can't prove it, يعني in the documents, I might share some documents. I was one of the employers I was trying to help here in Qatar. Just give me a moment. So these documents were provided to the court, and I want to show you how it's hard to prove to the court in regards to extra working hours. So basically, all these documents I'm gonna present here were submitted to the court, and I'll show you what was the judgment later on. So the first document, as you see, it's Eid holiday working. They are asking them to work in Eid from, if you can see down here, working hours from 5 a.m. to 3 p.m. Then if you go to the second document, we can see the overtime. Here they are asking them to work from 7:30 till 7 p.m. Again, all these documents were provided to the court. The third document is, the third and the coming documents are 3 documents where I have this brave worker. He's a rebel a bit. He's resisting. He don't want to work from 7:30 till 8, 9. So he started to leave at 4 p.m. Then they started warning him that they will terminate his contract. As you can see here, final warning and so on. Then the third one was like the worker started to threaten them by casing a file, and they used this thing to fire him, not to give him his rights. Then finally, we can see Labor Committee's official judgment. I just took the real judgment and putting it and showing it to you. As we see, I'm sorry it's in Arabic, but this is how it works in courts. This is the language. We can see that even when the labor submitted all the necessary documents, they stated that these documents are not enough because basically, I don't know if you are the one who worked for extra hours, neither that there is another document. These are not all the documents. He provided the court with all the worksheets that he'd been working from 8 o'clock till 8 night. But because these papers were not signed, so basically, they didn't take all these papers. Again, there is no company will provide the court with prove against themselves. And also there is one point I want to mention here that I didn't highlight it, but علاوة على أن تلك المستندات صادرة باللغة الإنجليزية, it means the laborers should even translate these papers to Arabic, which also they have to pay fees. They are already not getting paid. Again, how they can spend money on translating papers? This is only few of what they are going through in the courts. It's really rare that we can prove that they worked more than 10 hours a day. But in some other rare cases, as one of the female laborers I was trying to help in the court, company's lawyer, by mistake, provide the court with signed worksheets, which show us that, alhamdulillah, sometimes people can be stupid and go, and that goes in your favor. Going to domestic worker situation. Here in Qatar, it's more complicated. شوفوا labor, they all suffer, but domestic workers suffer, and as I'll point it to you. It's more complicated, and once I was asking Vani works in migrant rights, if any domestic, I was asking her if any domestic ever filed a case. Since myself, I've been in the court for a year, I never witnessed one. And she told me that 8 to 9 workers filed a legal case in Labor's committee, but it was settled before it turns to a case. Their employers paid them their salaries, and they went back home. And the way these cases are being settled, it gives impression that housemaid is guilty, although she might يعني, receive her salary mostly publicly, but she will be asked to leave Qatar, while the employer can immediately go to the nearest recruiting office and get another housemaid with no legal consequence or penalty. That's another issue. يعني. Also, I'll point some يعني, in a very brief way, some يعني, different points that domestic workers might be going through, but يعني, it's really hard to listen. I was writing this part, I was like, yeah, people should يعني, check a therapist once I finish this part. يعني. The first point is long working hours for more than 14 hours per day. They work from 8 o'clock till 9 o'clock, and sometimes it goes on. يعني in Ramadan, it's even worse. يعني when we compare it to the labor law, we can see that the working hours should be 6 hours, but it gets worse for domestic workers in Ramadan. Second point is no day off in the contract. If the contract is for 2 years, she will work continuously with no day off. The third point is annual or sick leave. When she gets sick, they might يعني, embarrass her by asking, why did she come for work if she is sick in the first place, as if like she is ill by her choice. The fourth point is isolation. Living in a culture that's totally different than yours, very close environment, and it differs from one house to another. If she's living in a palace or in the ghetto, it changes according to the mindset of the people that household, and يعني, it shouldn't be like that. It's supposedly be a work contract based on the law that guarantees the minimum rights, and that law also should be implemented effectively in the reality. The fifth point is violence. يعني domestic violence is a taboo to talk about in this society, but if sisters, daughters, wives يعني, are getting physically or physiologically abused, then it goes without saying that domestic worker will go endurance يعني, through it too. They are living in the same house after all. There's another important point I would like to mention is like since domestic worker law adopted in 2017. Firstly, we can notice that before it was no law that organized the relation between the employer and the employee. After 2017, yet the situation is not noticeably better since the law is not implemented. While domestic workers are living at the same house and being in a closed culture where the Qatari female ability is to step outside is يعني, questionable, it's not really hard to expect what's going on with them. I think lots of domestic workers يعني, don't get paid either, يعني, either at all or more than 10 hours a day. يعني, after all, they work more than 10 hours a day with no day off or annual sick leave. يعني, and they don't count it in the salary يعني, if we're gonna count it again. Not to mention that sometimes the contract states certain amount, for instance, 1,500, they get 1,000 Qatari riyal instead. These are several kind of issues they are going through. I'd like to share one story, which is at the beginning of this year. I met a guy who's in my age. He's working as a driver and cook and a housemaid for another Qatari guy, the same age again. They both were coming from abroad. The Qatari kid studied abroad, and the domestic worker helps him there. So they both were quarantined in the hotel where my friend and I were volunteering there. So he started telling us about how he can sleep at night because his kafir is up all night. And then early morning, after 2 hours of sleep, he gets kicked up and beaten for being asleep and resting. He showed us the scars. Also, he told us, يعني, it's not only him that's beating him. يعني, his friends also, يعني, they all gang up on him and beat him too. It's not. Another point was that he was not paid for 3 months. So here we have one main question is, what is the channels to track domestic workers in such a situation? Especially when domestic workers law states clearly that it's illegal to work, to make the domestic worker work abroad, and if this example shows us anything, that the thing is the real and physical presentation of modern slavery. Changing workplace is one of the difficulties that domestic worker and laborers go through too. One of the main obstacles in the kafala system is changing your workplace. It's easier under another contractual system, but under patriotic system, and especially when your situation is as bad as many people around you, that makes it even hopeless to change your workplace. Although it might be easier for laborers, but it's almost impossible for domestic workers. In regards to labor cases and domestic worker cases, it's a long journey. Since I started with laborers, yet I haven't finished any case with them that related to what I'm working on, and it's been almost a year now. One of them only found me before he quit his case. He was like, "Khalas, I'm done," and he was going to go back home. It's a physiological pressure. They prefer getting any amount rather than filing a case. Once they get nothing for months, then they think either of going back home or filing a case. Not to mention that they already don't trust the system here. In regards to domestic workers, they are living at the same house. So let's imagine that she or he, they can file a case and he was able to go back home to the same guy or person that they are living with and sued also. So the talk goes on while talking about their situation. There are other issues like exit permission, passport confiscation, privacy. All are direct or indirect consequences of the infamous kafala system that has been not abolished yet and replaced with contractual system. That should be contractual system is based on the will of both parties and balanced relationship between both the employer and the employee. To conclude, I'd like to end with a positive note and just to give you a glimpse of hope. From my experience and from what I saw on the ground, regardless of some laws remaining untouched and ineffective, some migrant workers started to speak out and look for a way out of their situation. Hence, many resorted to me, and which also stresses the importance of our role as employers to empower and advocate not only for our workers, but all workers in our lives. Conversation is and daily interactions. That we should not underestimate what we can do, and if we can help in any way to loosen the burden of the system, let's not underestimate it. So whatever we can do to change migrant workers' reality and Qatar and GCC in general. Thank you.
Hanan, first of all, I want to applaud you for the work that you've been doing, for your, for your courage and for your passion. That was very obvious in your talk. Thank you for sharing with us this new information that many of us didn't know about. Thank you for revealing the multiple layers of discrimination that the migrant workers have to go through. Thank you for talking to us about the issue of accountability and highlighting that this is not just a political issue, that this is a social issue, psychological issue. This is a humanitarian crisis, really. Now, I will ask brilliant panelists some questions, and then we will move on to our Q&A sessions. I have received some very interesting questions that the panelists will answer in a minute. Now, building on your discussions, my first question is to Dr. Amal Al-Malki. Dr. You were talking about some of the work that College of Humanities and Social Sciences has been doing, in promoting diversity and combating racism. What do you think, what role, in your opinion, can academic institutions play in combating racism in the Gulf and then create new narratives of belonging?
you, Zarqa. I believe in education, and I believe in the power of education, and I believe that education could play a huge role in bringing justice and peace to the world, and not just through educating well-rounded citizens and human citizens, but beyond that too. So in specific in those areas where there's a lack of research. So let's speak about our context where racism and issues of discrimination and injustice don't really appear as academic research. Then I think it is our role in the college and in the university to address that and document stories, lived realities of the people through quantitative research, and also stand on data. And quantitative research. So it's not just how many are affected, but how those people, and speaking about individual cases, are affected by certain laws that discriminate against certain people in the society. How is this manifesting itself? We need to see it. We need to hear those stories through our research. Also, there's a lack of scholarship. So there is a lack of scholarship and there is a lack of scholars. There's a huge paradigm shift. We are no longer looking at life through the angles or the perspectives of, let's say, the dominant narratives anymore. So Eurocentric narratives, for example, Eurocentric literature or Eurocentric history. There is a huge paradigm shift, and now we should be talking about and speaking and creating our own narrative in the Middle East. And this is very important to us in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and thus we've got the Department of Middle Eastern Studies department, where we generate literature and research that is about us. So building scholarship through scholars who are not just a participant in the culture and insiders, but also can ensure that objective distance as intellectuals and as scholars to study their own societies. And so that's a paradigm shift too. So scholarship, scholars, I would say lack of understanding and awareness in the society. And this is where I see the academia going out of its way, and it should. Okay, we're not confined to the walls of the universities. We should be talking to the society, and we should be affecting and impacting society and social change as well. So relieving some of the anxieties and dealing with those issues. I understand race, racism, discrimination are big words, not words that can be taken very smoothly. So we need to talk to the society, we need to break it down to them, and we need to make sure that it's not done in an attack. On the contrary, we all need to have this conversation to better our society. And lastly, I would say lack of NGOs and civil society. Again, I think as a college and academia plays a huge role in speaking and generating the interest of enough people who would create the civil society. We need civil society movements. We need people, we need the youth to engage in those topics. It's not only us intellectuals. We need people like Hanan and like Abrar, and we need to have this conversation and to take this conversation to the street, to talk to people about it, and then to gather all of those stories and all of those numbers, and then go. And I think we can play that role as well in academia to the decision makers and present it to them from a very different and new angle.
Thank you, Dr. Amal. The main points that I want to highlight about what you said is the need for contextual research, the need to talk about a step outside of Eurocentric frameworks of knowledge production, and the need to have NGOs. Thank you very much. Dr. Luana, my question to you is, you were talking about the power of data. Dr. Amal also touched upon this point. So what do you think can be the next steps to start research and constructive discussions on racism and discrimination moving forward?
Dr. Luana, you're muted.
That's the so what I was saying is that I'm breathing deep because what we are doing here precisely is what we need to do to start the conversation and to start research is listening. And I think one huge component of research is qualitative studies, is talking with people, is understanding the challenges, understanding what is not working about policy. Of course, we need willingness to make a change. That's the first step, right? So we need to have political leadership and also strategic leadership willing to do it. And once we have it, then we need to channel the resources. We have QNRF, we have numerous research funds that can channel funds to this. And I think if there is willingness to exchange with other researchers outside, the region and outside Qatar, I think there is a lot to gain when I hear what Hanan was saying about the Bedouin, Abrar was saying about the Bedouin community. I was just like hearing what indigenous people go through all over the Americas, North America, South America, is the same, is similar challenges. And when I hear about what Hanan is saying about the worker, I'm also a labor economist, and I've also done research in Brazil to help governments on how to make their labor intermediation policies more effective, right? So sometimes we say it might be a political issue, but sometimes it's just a policy ineffective issue. And you need research and you need to auditing studies to be able to identify those problems and design better policies. So I think that there is a rich, the good news is that there is a huge potential research agenda that can be done, to starting by collecting the data and analyzing the data. The country already has so much, if we just look at the QID, there is a lot of data. Qatar collects so much data. So I think we just need to roll up the sleeves and really start channeling more efforts into it.
Thank you, Dr. Luana. So the most important takeaway is the willingness to change and the willingness to roll up your sleeves and start working. I hope today will be just the beginning. Thank you. Abrar, my question to you is, how can the Bedouin a community be included in narratives of belonging, and does the change only have to be top down? What role can the society play in creating this change?
Thanks for your question, Zarqa. I think Dr. Luana mentioned a really important point that can partially answer your question, which is about the importance of listening. And I think this also takes us back to what I was trying to say at the very beginning, which is, the differences in the context between talking about the racism in the US versus talking about it in the Gulf. And I think one of the biggest differences is a different political context, right? Where political repression continues to be quite real, and where the ability to exercise your right to freedom of speech is not extended to all groups equally across the Gulf. So with that said, I think, when we're talking about how the Bedouin community especially can be included in the narrative, the reality is that their narratives are there. they exist. But because of the nature of the political context, so it makes it difficult for a lot of them to speak out publicly with their names and with their identities known. Because, like I mentioned earlier, there's collective consequences that extend not only to them as individuals, but to their families as a whole. So I think, one of the ways is for us to shed light on the narratives that are already there and that exist. So, like I mentioned earlier, there's been a rise in Bidun literature in the past 10 years. So those titles need to be read, discussed, and celebrated. So that's one way in which this can happen. Another, I think, is to also try and find ways to empower these narratives without also compromising the safety and security of people who are living in these precarious positions. As for your question on top-down change, I think that what makes Kuwait's scene, let's say, unique is the fact that a lot of change is often bottom up. It's often grassroots led. And this was actually something that I discovered, or not discovered, but emphasized while after I published my master's thesis, which was about the intersection of cultural production and politics, where you see that the majority of them were not state led, and the majority of them were born with the purpose of challenging the status quo and sending a message conveying that they are not okay with the way that things are. Now, granted, a lot of them were also complicit in reproducing a lot of these inequalities, but it's a much more nuanced case. As for how society can be involved, I think there's actually a lot of evidence in the past 10 years that, especially with the emergence of these kinds of spaces, these kinds of creative spaces that challenge the status quo and have successfully been able to break down a lot of the barriers that contributed to social segregation between groups that essentially have never interacted with one another before. I think that the reality shows that society is involved already in at the bare minimum interacting with one another, stepping out of our sheltered familiar spaces, exchanging different experiences, getting to know one another. And I think that then paves the path forward to building solidarity and building allyship in the long run. Sorry, I just want to point out one more thing. I noticed Dr. Luana mentioned the word Bedouin. It's actually Bedouin. They're a little bit easy to confuse. So the majority of Bedouin are Bedouin, but not all Bedouin are Bedouin. So when we're saying Bedouin, we mean nomads or people who are coming from tribes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Abrar. I think
Thank you.
what I took from your answer was that it's a matter of highlighting and choosing what we want to focus on, that there do exist narratives of belonging. It's a matter of what we focus on and what we choose to talk about and choose to celebrate. And that there are grassroots organizations that exist, and I think that is something to be applauded about. I hope other countries can also kind of allow for such grassroots movements to start. Thank you, Abrar. My last question to Hanan. Hanan, what do you think can we, the people, do in improving the migrant workers' situation here in Qatar?
I think as individuals, we can always start, as Dr. Aman said, educating ourselves, spreading awareness, is the next step. We start with educating ourselves by learning what they're going on, they are going through. Also, one another point is, I think, creating platforms and channels where laborers themselves can exchange knowledge and experience from each other. And I always recommend people to do join Insaniyat project. I always applaud to Noura for giving us the chance. It's a great start, I think, if you are interested in migrant rights. Both Noura and Vani doing great job there. There is another important point is, I think, creating ed groups, and whatever is your background. Like, for instance, I've studied law, then I can help them with their cases in the court. If you studied art, you can just give them workshops. What we were planning, even me and my friends, is we sat together and started like doing workshops for them in regards to like very general skills like Arabic language or basic Arabic language, drawing, leadership, communication skills. It's just some skills that they might use later when they go back to their countries. There is always ways. And maybe the best way to start as individuals, I think every household now there is a domestic worker. Start from there. Make sure that they are getting paid on time, working for less than 10 hours a day, getting a day off. I know it's really hard, since from my personal experience in my house with my mom, it's really hard to convince moms to let domestic workers go for a day off outside. And maybe to start with, go to the domestic worker law and start reading their rights, and then check every point once you accomplished one. And also, I have another thing. Vani is here, I think, and she wrote a great book. It calls The Stories of Origin. It's an awesome book, wallah. And maybe the best thing about this book is I was reading it and I was feeling the thing, as much as we talk, we are not living in their circumstances and in their situation. And what that book made me realize is more than what they are feeling, more than anything else. And that's a great book. Maybe we can read to educate ourselves. That's all for me. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Hanan. Once again, I want to really applaud you for your courage and everything that you've been doing with your colleagues this is really bottom-up change. So this is an example of bottom-up grassroots change, maybe not an institution, but individuals who care. Thank you for talking to us about the power of empathy, of educating yourself and taking small steps. Change can start from home. Now I will move to our question Q&A session. We have so many questions from our attendees. Thank you for staying with us until now and for engaging with us and asking us interesting questions. First question is from Moza. Moza is asking, as youth, how can we talk effectively about racism and discrimination to our parents and family who are conservative and less progressive? Anyone can answer this question. It's not directed to a particular speaker. Dr. Amal, do you want to talk about this? Answer this question? Or anyone else?
I would say Hanan or Abrar as youth would be better answering this question, but I would say one word, yes, humanize them. We speak about domestic workers as workers. People don't look at them as humans who have rights, unfortunately. So this is why Vani's book was very important, because you hear their stories from their own. Those are stories that have been narrated by themselves, and about it's just sometimes we learn by juxtaposing narratives. So I think by humanizing the story, by bringing it closer to home. I can't imagine my mom saying no if I said, would you imagine me working, for example, there, here, or there, within this context without having a day off? Bring it close to home. Maybe this would work. But again, the youth could speak more about it.
Hanan and Abrar, we want to hear from you.
Okay, so my opinion on this particular issue may not be so optimistic. Mine is that I think it's on a case-by-case basis, especially when we're talking about Khaliji parents. I think that some of them do have a willingness to hear you out and to change and to, challenge very deeply ingrained old ideas that they have carried with them for a very long time. And I think for a lot of them, it's that, they might say that, but my attitude is not racist, but they might use racist vocabulary. And, I think that vocabulary is often undermined. It is a form of microaggression, and it does have a very real impact on people who hear these kinds of terms. So, I think, these kinds of conversations you can always try with your parents, but I think the reality is that with a lot of them, you're not really going to get anywhere. So perhaps it's about, choosing your battles in the sense that, ask yourself, is there something tangible at stake here? Whether it's, the dignity of the domestic worker at your home, or even, for example, your own marriage prospects, going back to the point you mentioned earlier, this belief that Khaliji citizens could never be on the receiving end of racism. But this is something that comes up a lot, I think, in discussions about marriage with Khaliji parents. So my own take on it is that's a battle worth tackling when you have something tangible in place. If we're talking about parents who are a bit more difficult to talk to about these things, but if your parents are a little more open to hearing you out, by all means, definitely talk to them about these things.
Hanan, would you like to add something?
Well, I don't know what to say, Moza, but from personal experience, I think talking sometimes is useless and acting is way easier. And for example, myself, I'm just tired of talking. And sometimes we have to point out things. And since I'm sitting at home and something wrong happens in front of me, I start pointing it out. They laugh and they might don't take it seriously. But later on, I think they inside, maybe somewhere they think it. And I already pointed, it's not normalized anymore. I already pointed that thing. And I think I usually start with myself. It's really hard. I don't want to say society. I don't want to say family. Start with yourself. Educating yourself is the better way, because you just make sure that you did your best in this case.
The next question is from Sharifa, and bear with me, I have lost the question. Okay, Sharifa is asking, in what ways is racial identity constructed in the psyche in the Gulf? For example, an ethnic background, a religious sect association, tribal participation. What about physical color of the skin? Is that the same as the American context? Sharifa is asking us many important questions. I guess everyone can speak to this. Whoever wants to go first. I don't want to put anyone on spot. I'm tempted to say Dr. Amal, but why don't you decide who wants to go first?
Sorry, Zarqa, would you mind reading the question again just one more time?
Sure, yeah, it's a loaded one. In what ways is a racial identity constructed in the psyche in the Gulf? For example, through ethnic background, religious sect association, tribal participation. What about the physical skin color? Is that the same as the American context? So this, I think she's really talking about the psyche of racial identity in the Gulf.
Can I have a go?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think, of course, I'm not specialized in the Gulf, but because it touched on race in the US and in the Americas, I would say is that I will look more as all these things that were listed as different ways in which societies create hierarchies. Okay, so it's really a hierarchy by social class, or by family name, or by gender, or by religion, or by color of skin. And in every society, there are these intrinsic divisions, right? These hierarchy are intrinsically divisive. And and in order to maintain, it's just natural for the human being to want to be at the top, right? And want to be on power. And in order to maintain these divisions and these hierarchies, you need certain prejudices, stereotypes, and even racism, because to maintain a position of privilege and of power. So the problem here is when you start acting on those privilege and these stereotypes that you have. No, and when it comes to color of skin, particularly blackness and darkness, right? I believe that many people in the Arab world, and let me point out, many Muslims have understood that they cannot dissociate, they cannot separate their struggle, for example, with Islamophobia and the struggle of Blacks, and vice versa. And Blacks cannot dissociate. So it's these numerous stereotypes that both live, and sometimes layered after layered. I mean, it's the same stereotypes that can lead to a society with all those divisions. So we cannot cut ourselves from one thing or another, right? So we must stand up for what is right. And a good example is what, for instance, what happened in Bahia, in Brazil, many, many years ago, where Black Muslims fought side by side with Black Brazilians to liberate themselves from slavery. So, I mean, this is just to say that we need to accept our past, and do not turn a blind eye in what is going on around us, not be like the ostrich, right? So we need to together racism and discrimination.
Can I just briefly add also to that, to Farifa's question? Identities in the Gulf are very much politicized. I'm not saying that it's only politicized in the Gulf, it is for sure politicized elsewhere as well. But I think diversity and identity is very, very common, but people are made aware of their identities through everyday reminders, through national myths, through institutions like museums, through education even, through constructing, like Dr. Luana said, hierarchies, through constructing narratives of who belongs and who doesn't belong, and on what degree do you belong. So I think identities, are, especially because Sharifa, you asked about tribal identities and religious sectarian identities, these are very much political projects. Constructed by the political elite in many times, and then it becomes a naturalized process. Anyone else wants to talk about this? So, or shall I move on to the next question? Okay. The next question is from Khalid. Khalid is asking or commenting, labor law is distinct from domestic worker law due to the fact that domestic worker is working same hours as the housewife, for example. Does that make sense to you, Hanan? Do you want to answer that question?
Sorry, can you repeat the comment again, please?
Labor law is distinct from domestic worker law due to the fact that the domestic worker is working same hours as the housewife, for example.
Actually, I think moms works like 24 hours while domestic, and it's similar. Yeah, the law states. Yeah, definitely there is. First of all, there's this difference between labor law. Labor law stated in a very clear way that this law is not applicable on domestic workers. Then after 20 years, we had domestic worker law. As I even said in my talk, that there was no such law that organized the relation between the employer and the employee for such a long time. 2017 we had a law, and still this law is not implemented. And this is so true. I think when we look at their salaries, for instance, like they get 500, 600, the problem starts from like they don't really see that they are doing anything. When you go to the working hours or so, they don't really see that they are putting any effort because they're just they think like female are born with skills of cooking and cleaning, and that it's not really hard to do. So yeah, it's fine, we can do it. So yeah, that's true.
Khalid said it was a statement. Thank you, Khalid. Noted. Next question is from Nada, who is asking a question to Dr. Luana. She says, she's asking, in your opinion, what's the difference between racism and racial bias, and how should each be tackled?
So racial bias is where all begins, right? It's what I was explaining about the implicit bias is that stereotypical image that you have about somebody because of the race. So in economics, racial bias is generally measured by how much your returns are discounted simply because you have responded the race category in a certain way, right? So in terms of racism, then it's when we call it's a about one race being dominant, more worthy, with better capabilities, etc., vis-a-vis another race. So, and it's, as some said, it's a political project. It serves the interests of capitalist societies. It serves the interest of the whole, really, global system that we have to have a group of subjugated people, right? So must it be racialized? That's the question. Must it be racialized, and can we operate in different ways where we do not oppress people? First of all, in general, and second of all, because of the color of the skin. So it's so that's where the question lies now, moving forward. And what can we do about deracializing things? But until societies operate in that way, we need to continue measuring. We need to continue making it very bluntly evident that it exists in order for us to start talking and discussing and doing something about it.
Dr. Luana, we have a next question from Vani. Vani has actually joined us today. Thank you, Vani. The question is, can there be a way of making sure marginalized members of the society, sorry, this question has gone up. I've had many questions, so I'm trying to navigate through that. Bear with me. Okay, right. I cannot read Vani's question as of now. I promise I'll get back to it. In the meanwhile, I will ask a different question. Given the this is from Valeria. She's asking, given the race is a social construct created by the West, particularly the USA, how do you identify a race within the Arab culture? Good question. Who wants to answer this question?
Can I have a go?
Yes, please.
Okay. I mean, she's definitely right. I think this is something that a lot of people are actually unaware of. The fact that this concept in and of itself was a Western creation for their own colonial aspirations at the time. Whether there's an Arab definition or an Arab understanding of race, I think is still open to debate. As one of the questions, I want to say it was Sharifa's mentioned at the very beginning that we have so many layers, and we use the word racism to describe all of them indiscriminately. But I think what we see is a lot of this is not race based. You still, like, for example, if we're going to take the case of the Badoon in Kuwait, we're still talking about people who arguably come from the same race that the majority of Kuwaitis do as well. So I think that moving forward, the most constructive way of going about this is to not try and apply the same understanding of race to our own context, simply because clearly, it's something that manifests very differently,
I think it's very important to highlight that we need to have, and Dr. Amal spoke about this as well. We need to have our contextual understanding of what race means, and this applies to so many different concepts. Where we just take concepts from the West and we take it as a given, and we try to fit our realities based on those concepts. Whereas these concepts are completely coming and relating from different realities. The next question. So I was able to catch up with Vani's question. So she asks, can there be a way of making sure that marginalized members of society, migrants specifically, are able to tell their own story in whatever way possible? Art, writing, music, and how can CHSS facilitate that? Question to you, Victoria.
We're very open to suggestions, Vani. What we have been doing is, and I think Qatar Foundation as an establishment is very strong in making sure that it's diverse. It holds same responsibilities and rights all over. The workers at Qatar Foundation, I think, and I believe that have a better chance of reaching the people who are responsible there with any of their grievances and such. We've dealt with several, even within CHSS. But what we have been doing as an educational institute is make sure that all of our members, including workers in CHSS, have access to all of the privileges that we offer all of our members. So we opened up language courses. People who serve tea and coffee and cleaners in the building were able to take the classes. We make sure that we involve them in our events as well. Again, this is only one college. The thing could be spread. Definitely, it should be a part of our culture. I know Georgetown does lots of work with the immigrant, with the labor and on immigrant rights. And I know that our students are involved in volunteering as well. But is it systematic? Maybe not. And we're very open to any advice and suggestions. We would be more than happy if there's something in your mind, if you share it with us, and we would be very happy to lead the way as well, whether in Qatar Foundation and Hamad bin Khalifa, or even in the local community, if there's something that we could do. Yeah.
This question is from Haya. Haya is asking, even though the stateless people Bidun exist across the Gulf, why is that we only hear about them and their issues? Very important question. You are muted, Abrar.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, the last part of the question was, why is it that we only hear what?
About the ones in Kuwait and their issues. Why don't we hear about the other Bidun communities in the rest of the Gulf?
Okay. So I think it's purely as a result of the fact that there's a wider margin of freedom of expression in Kuwait. Despite, all of the repression that I described, I think it's quite telling, the fact that, you are still able to speak about injustices that happen in this country, which I think is not necessarily the case in other places. Whether you're somebody that's from that community or outside that community, there's still much more severe consequences in comparison to what happens in Kuwait. Yeah, I mean, I've struggled, frankly, to find documented accounts of what it's like to be Bidun in other Gulf countries. And as far as I'm aware, there's very limited, if any. And like I said, I think it's a result of the variations in margins of freedom of expression.
Thank you, Abrar. The next question is from, I'm not sure, and please forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong, Khafija. He says, I am a Black American living in Saudi. Why aren't there any Gulf males on the panel? I can answer that question for you. Like I said in the very beginning, I had reached out to many people in the beginning, trying to convince them to speak at today's panel, and unfortunately, no one from the males and females, for that matter, agreed to appear on this panel. And also, having said that, for a very long time, we've had male-only panels. So maybe it's not so bad that we have a female-only panel. Yeah. Thank you. Next question is from Dua. She says, great panel, thanks to all. I was hoping to hear about Black struggles in Qatar, starting from being labeled as Khawal, not being enough represented in media, how they are subjected to police and more likely to be arrested, and lastly, how their culture is not being celebrated as an essential component of the Qatari context. I leave the floor open to those who want to talk about this.
Well, there's no research on that, and this is why I think this is a very promising start to have this conversation. So please, yes, I'll take your question as a push for us, but please, what we need to do is hear more, like especially when it comes to the life of Black Gulfies or Black citizens of the Gulf. There is so little literature on it, and it shows itself more in novels. So we've got in Oman, for example, and we've got several novelists in Oman and I believe in Saudi Arabia who tackled this question. We don't have anything in Qatar yet that I'm aware of. And it starts that way in conservative societies where the very issue of race is a taboo, is considered a taboo. It starts with literature and then it permeates itself in other forms. But definitely, I think this is a topic that we need to address. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It does exist. It shows itself, or it manifests itself more in social segregation and you know, lack of intermarriages. Definitely, you see it definitely, but it is a part of a bigger context where the whole society is multi-layered. There are different stereotypes that control the relationship between different groups of people in Qatar. So it's not just the Blacks versus, definitely not whites, maybe, I don't know, browns. I'm not sure what we are, to say the truth, but we've got the descendants of Arabs versus descendants of Persian. We've got the natives versus the naturalized in Qatar. So there are many groups, Sunni, Shia as well, but there are many groups and there are many differences and there are many restrictions in their interaction between them. There's no research. We would be very happy to start this conversation. So please send us your thoughts.
To Dr. Emma's point, just really quick. I definitely agree with your point on the lack of formal research, but I think in this particular context, it's important for us to also be open to informal sources and ways of learning. So I don't have an answer for your question about Qatar, but I know that Asia, for example, who's a Kuwaiti social media influencer, recently handed over her account to a number of Black Kuwaitis to talk about their own experiences and their lived day-to-day lives as Black Kuwaitis. So I'll share that link later on. And just on the subject of informal sources, I've actually found that even TikTok videos say quite a bit. A lot of domestic workers in Kuwait, at least, I'm not sure if they've been doing it in Qatar as well, have been using TikTok to vent about just how overwhelmed they are with work since the beginning of the lockdown. So even a 10-second video can say quite a bit. And I think these sources informal sources can suffice in the meantime until formal literature is produced.
May also add, because it ties with the previous questions about race. What is race in the Arab context? And I think one thing that we all realize already, that of course there are many races and different countries have their own racial categories, and it's important, to in a local context. However, we all know that the largest discriminated group in the world are Blacks and dark-skinned people. We are 1.8 billion people in the world, of which, of course, 1.3 billion are in the African continent. But about 200 million live in the Americas, and the rest live all over the world. No, and it's a group of African descendants, right? So I think it's important to say that in the Arab context, at least we know there is one racial group, which are the Black Gulf citizens. They are already intrinsically racialized because society racializes them. Of course, other groups that are not phenotypically obvious to distinguish, right? It's more difficult to they are also, we cannot ignore them as another racial group if they are an ethnicity or a group that is oppressed because of their culture, because of their origin, and etc. So I think I totally agree there is more research to be done, but we cannot forget Black Arabs and Black Gulf citizens as the main or one very important group to look at. And in terms of research, Dr. Amal, Princeton has developed a palette of colors, right? And they have been doing research with that to see if, the darker your skin, the more disadvantages you accumulate, right? So this could be something just to start, because if in Brazil, it took 50 years for the Brazilians to arrive at a racial categorization. And asking people, how do you think there were 300 possible questions answers about how, coffee with milk, I'm a bit gold color, I'm a bit yellowish, and it was tremendous confusion until they realized that only 4 to 5 categories concentrated 90% of the population, right? And then you said, this is the power of research. And then they were accumulating that. And they're like, okay, the vast majority of the distribution of the population follow within these categories. And those 2 categories, the brown and the Black, fare much worse than the rest of the population. Hence, we can treat them as a racial group. So that's how you start building information and knowledge and start, just standardizing and becoming much more clear about what you're talking about. And I think between the time that Brazil got its independence till today, we are still researching. So, and maybe this is what it lacks in the Gulf, is this this time of, and I'm so interested in the Twitter account and to also start hearing those stories about Black Kuwaitis. Thank you so much, Abra, for that.
The next question is directed at me, but I think I would like to invite the other academics here to answer that question as well. It's from Zohra, and she says, I know that the focus is on workers and immigrants. What I like to hear is about the differential treatment and implicit bias in academia and education city. Since my personal experience, I think definitely academia, like any other institution, suffers from racism, discrimination. Personally speaking, from my personal experience, I think although it's such a discrimination might not be institutionalized, we might have policies that might enable us, but on a more interpersonal level, I do see biases that emerge. If you're, for example, a brown woman, a mutahajba woman, a young academic, you would find people either not taking you. So there's different intersectionalities, and I have faced a few of them, where you would not be either taken seriously as opposed to a male who's of your age, or even more if it's a if it's a white male of your age, or much less publications than you, but just because he or she speaks with an accent that is British or American, or he or she has a white color, might be taken more seriously than you. So these are internalized biases that do exist, and I have faced them in education studies. So yes, definitely racial biases in academia. And I actually would like to invite Dr. Amal and Dr. Luana to also comment on this.
Dr. Aman? Okay. No, yes, like any, academia is not outside of the society. Academia is inside the society. So if societies are biased, the editor of the journals are going to be biased. The whole apparatus, academic apparatus, and your colleagues, etc. And you just see lack of representation in academia all over the world. Black economists in the US were just coming up to denounce racism also in the course of the peer review and publications in journals. I mean, and the lack of editors, Black editors that would be interested in the topics that are of interest of also other Black economists. So I think, yes, that's a clear cut also as part of society.
I'm gonna interject here and say something else, to say the truth, because speaking about the foundation in general. So there are more than 60 nationalities among students in Qatar Foundation. There is a very generous scholarship scheme. I've taught students from different parts of the world, from different backgrounds, and I know that we strive to reach out to the underprivileged. I know that for sure. Now, we have to bear something in mind, that the education city is a combination of different educational systems, and each education system has its own privilege, stands for itself, and has its internal biases. So yes, there are biases, sometimes within certain institutions within the bigger foundation, but if we're able to expose it, it would stop. Yeah, there's a bigger system that would regulate the relationship, and this is where we are lucky. But it doesn't mean that there are no biases against women. For example, I was discriminated against as a Qatari academic as well, not by people, but the system did not embrace me well at the beginning. It took some time to frame me or put me in the corner that suits me, and I was the only one. So that is inherited, that is known within academia. But again, I have to be very frank and say, really frankly and sincerely, that in Qatar Foundation, we make sure that that there is an access to quality education, that there's gender equality, and that we take care of our people. Now, the vision is there. People know that this is what we need to do in Qatar Foundation. If someone fails to expose an area of injustice, then we have to, or otherwise we'll be all complicit.
Thank you, Dr. Amal and Dr. Luana. Now, so we have actually finished the time for today's event. It's 9:03 p.m. The last question, because it has been asked repeatedly, is the book that Hanan mentioned. We received multiple questions asking once again the title of this book and the author you could please mention that.
It's Vani's book. It calls Stories of Origin. In Arabic, it's قضايا الخليج تحت المجهر. I think you can find it on Amazon.
Thank you, Hanan. We will try to, if we can post the title of the book. Thank you for everyone for joining us. We have so many more questions that we unfortunately couldn't take. I have around more than 55 questions, but we have to end today's session. I would like to thank, first of all, our panelists who were willing to speak very frankly and passionately about discrimination and racism and engage in constructive discussions. I would also like to thank some 90+ people that joined us today. I've just been told by our team that we've had around 90 and more people joining us today who stayed with us till the end. Thank you everyone for joining us. And I would like to also thank our communications team who put so much effort into making today a successful. I don't think we have been appreciating enough how much work goes into online events. I want to thank Riman and Amin for working tirelessly to make this a success. Thank you very much. And please follow our webpage for more events, webinars in the future. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zafar.
Thank you.